Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Histories in Miniatures video. This is the conclusion of my kind of mini-series about Napoleonic Wars, but if people like it, I will happily talk more about it in future, maybe breaking down some particular interesting engagements or particular interesting units, maybe breaking into tactics a bit more heavily and a bit more weighty. Today I'm going to be talking about cavalry and the role of cavalry within the Napoleonic Wars. Now, before I get too deep into kind of tactics and strategies, I'm just going to quickly gloss over the sort of sizes of formations and things. So your average kind of formation of cavalry would be known as a squadron. A squadron would comprise of about 140 men, and they would normally be two companies, so you'd have two companies per squadron. You'd normally have about 4 squadrons per regiment as well, so a regiment of cavalry, you could maybe roughly estimate of about 600 men and horses. Normally the first company as well, or the first squadron of each regiment would be the biggest, burliest, bravest, toughest men, and it'd be kind of seen as the elite and nicest sort of place to be. In the Napoleonic Wars, you'd have 4 types of cavalry. Let's talk about the first one first. You would have light cavalry. These guys' main sort of role was more about reconnaissance, disruption, and protecting flanks of armies. So you'd have both sides light cavalry push into each other and maybe cause a bit of damage, maybe clash swords, and then someone would run away and the other cavalry would follow. They weren't seen as a massive tactical advantage on the battlefield, but they definitely had their uses. And the ability to spot an enemy, see maneuver, see movement, that's huge. You would have medium cavalry, and these would kind of be the most common type of cavalry. They would do a similar role to heavy cavalry, which I'll explain in a moment, but equally they kind of had their own sort of uses as well. They were a lot more flexible than heavy cavalry. They were not often seen as dragoons, so they'd often have carbines or rifles of some sort, so they could open fire, they could dismount and shoot. They kind of were a bit of a jack of all trades, and you could bring them into where you needed them at certain points. You would also have the heavy cavalry. These are the big burly guys on big burly horses, and their job is to charge in and break up formations and cause as much damage. Again though, if an infantry regiment is in a square, you very rarely see a successful cavalry charge. You need to be able to bring them and hit them in at the right point. You can't just say the heavy cavalry are the kings of the battlefield, because they genuinely weren't. They needed to be used in concert with everything else around them. In the Napoleonic Wars, in the Battle of Waterloo for example, Marshal Ney used the cavalry terribly because he charged them all out against the British, and the British all formed squares and the cavalry ran in between the squares and got shot to pieces. Then he did it again, and then he did it again, and then he did it again, and there was no success. Those squares were not broken just because heavy cavalry was swarming around them. And the final type of cavalry you have is the lancer. Now, the lancer is often a guy with a lance to do stabby stuff with. These guys kind of sort of fit into 2 camps. They were light enough and manoeuvrable enough to sort of do the role of light infantry. They could get around places and see stuff. But equally, because of the advantage of the lance, they were actually heavy enough to hit like heavy cavalry when needed. They're often seen as quite an elite formation, an elite unit, and there weren't a great deal of them. But the lancer was kind of a dual purpose role. So you'd have a heavy for heavy hitting, medium for kind of the jack of all trades, light for moving around and sort of seeing stuff, and lancers for kind of seeing stuff and hitting hard. Equally, the lancer had a distinct advantage against other cavalry because they could hit him with a lance, and it would often disperse formation pretty quickly. The British were actually quite notoriously known to have poorly commanded cavalry that would often overrun, overreach, and then become countercharged by the French cavalry, for example, and then wiped out. So the British commanders sort of knew they could use their cavalry for one decent punch somewhere, and then they'd probably be ineffective for the rest of the battle, where they're scattered, poorly commanded, damaged, and they don't kind of reform again. The cavalry were kind of the facilitators and the tip of the spear when it comes to battlefields during the Napoleonic Wars. They were there to give your units the space to move. They were there to find out where you needed to go. They were there to kind of maneuver your infantry regiments where they needed to be. The cavalry provided a screen, they provided a support, and they let you keep your formations how they needed to be. Equally, the cavalry were there to disrupt the enemy formations, the cavalry were there to scare off the enemy's cavalry. The cavalry there were hopefully, if you're very lucky, to kind of get in on the artillery and really damage and break stuff. Again though, if your units are wise and cavalry are coming, often the artillerymen would just run into an infantry square and hide. Because I'm not going to stand by this cannon and die. And when the cavalry have peeled off again, the artillerymen would leave the square, go back to the artillery and continue firing. So cavalry had a very useful role, but it had to be used very wisely and very well, and you needed a decent cavalry commander to make the most of it. that's kind of all I want to say about cavalry for now. I think I've covered a decent amount. I might make more videos of these in the future. If you enjoyed them, thank you very much. Please like, comment, subscribe, share with the world, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!